Today we're sewing the Winter Wear Designs Double Take Tank. This tank includes just a couple of pattern pieces, but it still gives you some great options. There are 3 length options for this tank: short, straight, and shirt tail. You also have your choice between 2 back styles, a standard tank or a racer back. And lastly, you can customize the width of your bias binding for your neck hole and armholes, either choosing double fold bias tape or single fold bias tape. I'm going to be cutting out, applying, and demonstrating both styles of bias tape for this pattern so that you can choose between the 2 and decide which one better fits your blouse. So join me as we cut out our fabric, prepare our bias tape, and make a beautiful new blouse. I've gone ahead and cut out my front and back bodice pieces on the fold, and I also used my tracing wheel and tracing paper to mark my darts onto the wrong side of my front bodice piece. Now I'm ready to cut my bias binding strips. Using my clear gridded ruler, I'm going to cut strips of fabric at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. If you're making double fold bias tape, you want the width of these strips to be 1.5 inches wide. If you're making single fold bias tape, you want the strips of your fabric to be 3/4 of an inch wide. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to make double fold bias tape for my neckline and single fold bias tape for my armhole bindings. And I'm just making sure that the length of each strip will fit the circumference of my neck hole and my armholes. To prepare your single fold bias tape, take your strips to your ironing board and fold both of your long edges to the wrong side so that the long edges meet in the middle. And if you have a bias tape maker, you can use this to help you slowly pull through your fabric and press as you go. And the process for your double fold bias tape will be the same. You're going to fold the raw edges to the wrong side of the fabric to meet in the center and give that a good press from one side of the bias tape to the other. And then for your double fold bias tape only, you're going to take this pressed strip and fold it once again in half all the way across. To prevent our fabric from stretching along the arm side and the neckline, it's recommended that we stay stitch these areas. Take your front and back pieces to your sewing machine and sew along your neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. Also do this for your arm size from your shoulder seam to the underarm seam. Do this for both arm size and your neckline, again for your front and back pieces. And now we're ready to prepare both of our darts on our front bodice piece. Fold your dart in half, pin through one dart leg and out the other. And do this for both darts. Now we can take our pinned darts to the sewing machine and sew from the outside edge to the point. The pattern instructions say to backstitch when you get to the points, but I like to leave long thread tails at both of the points and then tie them in knots. And then take your darts to your ironing board and press them down toward the bottom of the bodice. Now place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together, matching your shoulder seams. And pin or clip in place. Sew your shoulder seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and then finish your seams with your preferred method. You can finish your seams with your serger or a zigzag stitch. I'm going to be using my serger. And now with your front and back pieces still right sides together, pin or clip your side seams. Do this on both sides. Now we can go back to our sewing machine and sew both of our side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Finish your seams once again in your preferred method with your zigzag stitch or your serger. Once you've sewn and finished the seams for your shoulders and side seams, take it to your ironing board and press all of your seams toward the back of the garment. For my neckline, I'm going to be using my double fold bias tape. I folded one short edge of the bias tape to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch, and I'm going to place that folded edge right sides together with the back of my garment matching up one raw edge of my bias tape with the raw edge of my neckline, and pin in place. Then I'm going to continue pinning my bias tape, matching the raw edges all around the neckline until I'm back where I started. Once I'm back where I started, I'm going to allow the loose end of my bias tape to overlap that folded edge by about 1/2 inch and trim off any excess beyond that. And then pin in place. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew in the crease that I pressed into my bias tape earlier, the crease that's closest to the raw edge. Sew into that pressed crease all around the neckline. Now that we've sewn our binding all around the neckline, we're going to clip into the seam allowance. Use your scissors to make a series of clips all around the neckline to the stitching line but not beyond. This will help give a little bit of ease to the material so that it curves nicely around the neckline. Now we can open out this binding so that the wrong side of the bias tape and the wrong side of the bodice are facing you, and then press your seam allowance up toward the binding all the way around the neckline. Try to press using only the tip of your iron so as not to disturb the creases that we've made into the bias tape. Now we can take the outer raw edge of the bias tape and fold it to the crease that's in the center of the bias tape, and then fold that on the center crease so that it just covers our stitching line. Now the bias tape is folded along the center crease that we pressed into the tape earlier. And you should have equal amounts of bias tape showing on the inside and the outside of your garment, which should be about 3/8 inch on both sides, and pin in place. Now your bias tape should look like this on the inside and this on the outside, again with equal amounts of bias tape visible from the inside and the outside of the garment. Now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and place our needle on the side of the bias tape with 1/8 inch seam allowance, 1/8 inch away from this original seam line. This will ensure that we're catching this inner fold of the bias tape as we sew. And sew this bias binding all the way around. And then give that neckline a really good press all the way around. Typically, you would want the binding that you use for the neckline and the armholes to be the same, but for this video, I used double fold bias tape for the neckline, and I'm going to be doing single fold bias tape for the armholes, just to demonstrate the difference between the two bindings. The process is going to start out the same. I'm going to fold one short edge of my bias tape to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch, and I'm going to place one of the raw edges of that binding at my underarm seam and start pinning in place, matching the raw edge all around the armhole until you're back where you started. And when your loose end is back at that underarm seam, allow that material to extend over the folded edge of the bias tape that you started with by about 1/2 inch, pin in place, and you can trim off any excess bias tape beyond that. Now we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew in the pressed line on our bias tape, the pressed line that's closest to the raw edge, all the way around. Once that binding is attached, if you find that your stay stitching is visible from the right side of your garment, you can unpick those stitches at this time. You can just unpick at about 1 or 2 inch intervals, and then you should be able to just pull those thread segments right out. And once that binding is attached, we can make those clips into the seam allowance just as we did for the neckline, making a series of clips to the stitching line but not beyond. And then you want to open out your bias tape along that seam line so that the bias binding and the wrong side of the bodice are facing you, and press your seam allowance away from the bodice and toward the binding. Careful to use the tip of your iron so that you don't disturb the pressed lines in our bias binding. Now take the raw edge of your bias binding and fold it along the crease in your binding closest to that raw edge. And then fold your binding on the seam line so that now that raw edge is tucked underneath and the binding is not visible from the outside of the garment. And pin in place all the way around. Now we're going to take it to our sewing machine, and sewing from the inside of the garment, we're going to sew all along that folded inner edge of the bias tape with about an 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. So here's what my armhole looks like from the outside, with the bias binding invisible from the outside of the garment and extending beyond that seam by about 3/8 of an inch to the inside of the garment. Whichever binding method you used for one armhole, repeat all of those steps to bind your opposite armhole, and then give both armholes a really good press. Now the very last step is to hem the bottom of the blouse. Take the bottom raw edge of your blouse to your ironing board and press up that raw edge to the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 of an inch. With that fold in place, you're going to press an additional 1/2 inch all the way around. Now with our pressed creases in place, we're going to fold that hem to the inside with the 1/4 inch fold tucked under, and then we're going to edge stitch with at most a 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. Give your hem a nice final press and you're all done with your blouse.